Safer Chemicals Podcast. Sound science on harmful chemicals.
Welcome to Safer Chemicals Podcast. This episode is all about biocides, as we'll find out more about the topics covered in the September meeting of our Biocidal Products Committee. Erik van der Plassche, the chair of the committee, joins us to talk about biocidal active substances and EU-wide authorizations of biocidal products that were on the agenda this time. We'll also get an update on the comparative assessment of anticoagulant rodenticides and go through a few other topics that may affect companies. Hello, Erik. Good to have you back.
Yeah, thank you. Good to be here.
Should we get started with the active substances again?
Sure.
You had an interesting discussion about properties that lead to meeting exclusion or substitution criteria.
Mm-hmm.
And more specifically, you talked about persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic, or very persistent and very bioaccumulative substances.
Mm-hmm.
Before we go into more details and why this opinion is important for companies, could you briefly remind us what the exclusion and substitution criteria mean?
Within the regulation, there are certain substances with hazard characteristics which are very severe, like they are carcinogenic or they have these persistent bioaccumulative and toxic properties. Those are substances we in fact would like to ban from the European market and would like to replace with safer alternatives. And that's the exclusion means in fact that you cannot be in the market unless you meet a certain condition, for example, that the substance is essential. And substitution means that we want to look for safer alternatives. So these approvals are subject to what is called a comparative assessment, where they will be replaced if a safer alternative can be found. Now, in this case, we discussed indeed a document which we prepared as a secretariat, as an agency, related especially to PBT and ED substances, because it happens now and then that we get information after the active substance is already approved, during, for example, an application of a biocidal product. Then the company submits information on its ED properties or on its PBT properties. Procedure for that was adopted by the Commission in the CA meeting, and we now had to implement that procedure within the committee. And that means when we get that information, a member state would need to do the evaluation, and within the committee we will then what we call validate the status of the active substance, so meaning will it meet the PBT criteria based on the information or not. We will lay that down in the minutes, and that means that in fact the criteria are met, but in principle it does not have any regulatory impact, because only when there is a legislative act from the Commission, and that will happen normally under the renewal of an active substance, then the Commission has the power to decide that a substance is a candidate for substitution or meets the exclusion criteria. And the whole issue is maybe, let's say, of a temporary nature, because as you may know, the CLP criteria are changing, meaning that in the near future, the ED criteria and the PBT assessment will move to the classification and labeling regulation. And that means we will no longer assess that within our framework, but that will move to CLP. So I don't know exactly when these new criteria will start to be implemented, but this is something I think for 1 or 2 years, something like that.
If we move on to the active substance approvals then, I'd like to start with sulfur dioxide.
Mm-hmm.
This was not only assessed as an biocide here at ECHA, but also as a food additive by the European Food Safety Authority.
Yeah, that's correct. Sulfur dioxide was an active substance we discussed in the meeting of this week. And it was a long process, maybe to start off with that one, that this sulfur dioxide evaluation took something like 4 years. And indeed, one of the reasons is that this substance is also assessed within the framework of the Food Safety Authority. It's used as a food additive. In wine, I guess that many of us know that from our public. Also, there are other applications. In biocides, it's used for the disinfection of wine barrels. So then you have a sulfur tablet which you ignite, and then the barrel will be preserved. And the other application we had is that it's used for preservation of shoes. So you have a shoe box, they put a sticker in it, and that will release also sulfur dioxide, and that's used for the transport of shoe boxes. But as I said, it was a long process, partly due to the fact also that we're dealing with information which is very old. The information we have on the risks and the hazards of sulfur dioxide. Yeah, maybe to say that we struggled, and also the EFSA colleagues struggled on to evaluate that information and come to the what we call the reference values to be used within our risk assessment. In terms of timing, we are first. So in the end, we approved both these active substances. So it's this application in the shoebox and in wine barrels. The term everybody knows nowadays is one substance, one assessment. And yeah, there we try to align, of course, as much as possible, because we're dealing sometimes with the same data, and then obviously would like to come to the same conclusions. And at this point of time, we do not know exactly whether there will be differences between the evaluation from the EFSA agency and us. It might be that there are discrepancies, although we would assume that they will be minor, but we need to see what will be the outcome of the EFSA panel. And if that's going to be materialize, then EFSA and us, we will publish a document explaining the evaluation processes and also explaining the discrepancies if they are going to occur. But that we need to wait first what will happen within the EFSA process.
Can I come back to something that you said earlier there? You said that the information that you had at hand is quite old. How does that affect your evaluation or assessment?
This information was, more than 30 years old, I think. And that means that the studies have not been carried out to the standards of today. And it sometimes makes also the interpretation more difficult. So these are more what we call not standard studies which are carried out nowadays for the endpoints we are having. But these were open literature studies where you really need to dig into the data and see how you can interpret the results of those studies. And yeah, there was quite some information available. Even EFSA did an additional literature review and came up even with some other studies which are not present within our framework. So yeah, the interpretation of old studies is much more difficult than a straightforward laboratory study which is contracted out by an applicant.
Okay, that's interesting. If we move on to the next active substance, something that caught my eye was ozone, which has many uses, for example, to disinfect swimming pools and cooling water systems. You have already adopted opinion on ozone in one of your earlier meetings. What happened this time?
Yeah, this is the second application we got for ozone, which is generated from oxygen or produced from oxygen. And again, this is a bit of a complex situation. So we had two applications, one from a company to the German authorities, which indeed we already adopted a year ago. And now we got the application which was submitted to the Netherlands, in fact for the same substance, so also for ozone. And there were slight differences in the uses where the company applied for, especially for product type 2. In this case, we dealt with laundry disinfection, also with what is called airspace treatment. While in the German application, if I call it that, there we had swimming pool disinfection. So that we did not have for the application which was submitted to the Netherlands. But in terms of the use of ozone in the food industry, indeed you refer to cooling water systems, also disinfection of drinking water. that was also present in this application. So in terms of the risks and the safety and the measures which would need to be taken to be able to approve ozone, that was in fact quite straightforward and similar to what we had for the other application. The main discussion we had was again, and that was also in the German application, on the use of ozone by the general public. Last time there was this debate simply because of its properties. It has some CMR properties. And there has been a debate in the CA meeting in Brussels related to this topic. Let's say there was an understanding from some of the members and also from the Netherlands, who was the rapporteur for this application, that ozone cannot be used by the general public. But that appeared not to be the case. It all has to do with what is the active substance, what is the biocidal product, are we dealing with pure ozone, or are we dealing with ozone in a more diluted form, let's say. And then it depends a bit on the application and the device which is used to generate ozone. So in the end, what we decided that we, let's say, did it the same as we did for the other application. No flat-out ban for use for ozone by the general public. And that means that the whole discussion will be moved to product authorization. And we think from our side it would be good that we get some concrete examples on how these systems are used. And then, decisions in the end will have to be taken. What are the consequences for use by the general public? And there are quite some applications for this. So the swimming pool disinfection we already mentioned, use of ozone for laundry disinfection. It's used in refrigerators. So there are many applications where this will be relevant. So the Commission will now take the decision from us on board. We assume they will straightforward, let's say, move into an approval regulation where ozone will be approved without too many conditions. But then interesting discussions will take place once we move to product authorization, which is a couple of years from now.
Looking forward to that. Is there anything else that you'd like to add for the active substance approvals?
Yeah, we had two other substances, iodine and Mecetronium ethyl sulphate. So that's a quaternary ammonium compound. And that's an active substance which is used in hand disinfection for product type 1. Yeah, and there we came in the end to the conclusion that this substance cannot be approved. And it was not so much related to risks or the lack of efficacy. It was related to the fact that there was insufficient data to come to a conclusion on whether the substance meets the ED criteria or not, or whether the substance is bioaccumulative or not. And that's, of course, very important for the assessment of the PBT properties. So there was not enough information available. We need that information because we have to come to a conclusion on these properties. Otherwise, the Commission will not be able to take a decision on an approval. So, yeah, the applicant submitted information, but in the end, that was not sufficient to proceed. Here we had, in the end, we took a vote. There are minority positions on this one, but the majority of the committee was clear that insufficient data available, so we cannot approve this substance. Yeah, the other one was iodine, and also the one related to it is called PVP-iodine. That's what we call an early review. So because there are indications that iodine is suspected of having ED properties, the Commission asked us to already early on look at whether the substance meets these criteria before the renewal will take place. Sweden acted as the rapporteur, and in this case the committee concluded, and of course the technical and scientific discussions took place in the working groups, where it was clear that iodine is meeting the ED criteria because its effects on the thyroid. So that opinion was quite straightforward, I must say. But it's an important opinion. Iodine is used in many applications, for example, in tea disinfection for milking cows. We already have authorizations for biocidal products on the European market. So the industry was present at the meeting, was, and I would say rightly so, very interested in what will happen now when we have taken this decision and moved this opinion to the Commission.
And what are the consequences then?
Well, the consequences in principle are that we cannot have an application or there can be no authorization for the union. So a union authorization is not possible when an active substance meets the exclusion criteria. So that's one thing which is very important. And there are existing union authorizations already granted, and there are even ongoing applications. So that's an aspect where the companies, of course, want to get clarity on what will be happening with those existing authorizations. What the Commission made clear at the meeting is that, if it's now known that iodine meets the ED criteria, it's a substance which is an exclusion candidate. There will be a follow-up. So for these type of substances, they need an analysis of alternatives. So we need to look at whether there are alternatives which can be used instead of iodine for the applications which there are. And they will also ask, probably with a new mandate to the agency, to look at the risks now from iodine. Iodine, as you may know, it's an essential element. And that was also brought forward by the industry, and we all, of course, as competent authorities, are well aware of this.
You mentioned that as there is quite a lot of interest on this, that companies clearly need some clarity.
Mm.
Is there any expectation? When will there be more clarity then?
Well, that will still take some time, I guess, because, let's say, first of all, the Commission needs to receive the opinion and the analysis of alternatives. Iodine is used in quite some applications. So I mentioned teeth disinfection, but also in the food industry, iodine is used. So it's used in a wide range of disinfectant applications. And so that's quite some work, let's say, to look at that. And we will need to find a rapporteur who would be able to do this. But even more, the risk assessment for iodine will not be a simple exercise due to the fact that you have this complication indeed of the essentiality. And we already did that for bromide. There is a lot of information on bromide, but if you look at iodine, there's a huge amount of information on iodine. And not only, of course, for human health, but also for the environment. Yeah, I am not able to give you a timeline, but I guess it will still take some time before we, let's say, we finalize the whole exercise, meaning the Commission will need to decide, do they take legal action or regulatory action before the end of the first approval period of iodine and PVP-iodine.
So sounds like we might also be coming back to this topic at some point again.
Yes, for sure. Yes.
Good. If we then move from the active substances to something else, I have on my list the comparative assessment of anticoagulant rodenticides. We talked about this in our December episode last year, and at the time you discussed guidance on rodent traps developed by the German Environment Agency.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned then that this guidance will play an important role when assessing whether mechanical traps could replace anticoagulant rodenticides.
Mm-hmm.
But what exactly are these anticoagulant rodenticides, or AVKs?
As the name already says, these are chemicals, very poisonous, who prevent the blood from clotting. So that's the mechanism by which they act. So rats and mice, they simply die from internal bleeding, which takes place a few days after they have consumed the bait. And they are already on the market for a very long time. And another important disadvantage of these rodenticides is that they lead to poisoning in the food chain. So to explain in simple terms, you have a mice which consumes these AVK rodenticides, which is eaten by a bird or is eaten by another animal. And that by that mechanism, let's say, it's transported into the food chain. And as these are bioaccumulative, that would mean in the end you will see some effects of these chemicals in top predators. They meet the exclusion criteria because then of their classification. And that means we would like to ban them and replace them by more friendly substitutes. But that has not been easy over the last decades.
And the classification for these substances?
Yeah, they are classified for their CMR properties, category 1, so that means they need to be banned. And they're also PBTs.
Okay. And so in this meeting, you looked at this comparative assessment. What can you tell about this debate?
That was, one of the highlights of the meeting, I must say. It's an opinion request from the Commission to look at this comparative assessment for the whole of the EU. Normally, member states do this on national level, but now, because of the let's call it the importance of the topic, and it's more effective and efficient to do it at EU level, they asked the agency to carry out the comparative assessment. And this was the first time we discussed it. We already had a draft opinion which we sent out for consultation to all the members, and also stakeholders we informed in this topic, where there was quite an interest, not only from the chemical industry, so the producers of anticoagulant rodenticides, but also from companies who are involved in the production or sales of rodent traps. And there has been really a real development in that market. Driver for that is the digitalization. So that means that, let's say, when you place a rodent trap, of course, you would need to see whether the trap has catched a mice or a rat. And then in the past, let's say, you would need to visit those traps. But nowadays, with new technology, they can put a little camera or they can put a little sensor. So that means that from the office, let's say, you can see whether the traps have been successful in catching mice or rats. Because it's not the first time we had this comparative assessment. We already had it 5 years ago. And then, in fact, we had insufficient information to see whether there mechanical traps or non-chemical alternatives, as we call them, can be used as an alternative to the AVK rodenticides. But this time we really have information, and these efficacy trials were carried out according to the guidance which was prepared and also which is, let's say, agreed on at an EU level. So what we have done is to look first of all at chemical alternatives. Over there we concluded that there might be 2, but only for mice control indoors. And for the rest we don't have, let's say, sufficient number of chemicals to replace the AVK rodenticides. But still, when you start looking at practical advantages or disadvantages, at economics, at risks, we were not really able to conclude whether the 2 chemicals which we consider to be an alternative, whether they can really be used as an alternative. And I think that's not for nothing, because these substances, they have to kill rodents, so they for sure need to have a certain property which is not always wanted, let's say. So for some situations it might be possible, but we're not sure over there. That was, I would say, confirmed by the members. They also pointed to carbon dioxide, which can be used as an alternative, where we think there are some disadvantages. This is kind of quite similar to a rodent trap, a canister of CO2 which will kill a mice in a certain small box. In large infestations, we think, or in, for example, sewage systems, it would be very difficult to use these kind of traps. But that's something we will need to look into. But the main discussion was around the rodent traps indeed. There were, let's say, contrasting arguments made by both parties. Of course, the rodent trap industry They are convinced that these rodent traps are efficacious, can be used, can replace AVK rodenticides for certain uses, but maybe even for more. Although they also say we have difficulty in making information available because they are also used in sensitive industries like the food industry or the pharmaceutical industry. And on the other hand, we had the chemical industry who had more reservations, if I may say so, on the use of rodent traps. And we were a bit in the middle in a sense that we see those arguments, they come from both sides. And for us, that's quite difficult how to deal with this. As often these are statements, and I do not talk so much about efficacy. So there was an efficacy trial where they really demonstrated that for mice control indoors, these rodent traps are efficacious according to the guidance we have. But when you then start looking at economic and practical disadvantages, are they more costly or not if you compare them to AVK rodenticides? There are different arguments around the table. Also, the last element maybe which I would like to say what we discussed was the use of what we call integrated pest management. So, and I think also that's where we move maybe a bit to that, and that was for sure also mentioned by the chemical industry, but also an association involved in pest control, that there are many, let's say, there are several possibilities when you have an infestation. And you will not immediately start with using rodenticides. You will first make an assessment of the whole situation. And then for a pest control officer or company, they said they would like to have all tools available to be able to manage and combat such an infestation. So they made an argument, let's please keep all the possibilities we have, not start banning EVK rodenticides for the uses we have, but keep it all in place and then moving towards a more sustainable pest control scheme. So yeah, that's a bit what we had. It was quite interesting. It was a first discussion, and we will now need to take all these comments on board and then move forward.
And what will happen next then?
Well, we aim to adopt this opinion at our next meeting in November. But there were some requests made by members and by the stakeholders. For example, there is more information coming, and as I already said, there are developments on these rodent traps. So more efficacy trials are carried out with different traps, not only for indoor but also for outdoor control of mice. That will become available by the end of this year, beginning of next year. So the issue is, are we going to wait for that or not? We would say, in principle, not, because this whole comparative assessment is relevant for the renewal of AVK products, and that's coming soon. So member states cannot wait too long. They need this opinion to be able to take decisions on the granting of their authorizations. But of course, the information is quite relevant to see whether we can also have rodent traps as an alternative for other uses. And then there was some other requests were made. So there was more information from for some chemicals. There was a request to look at permanent baiting, whether we can look into that into more detail. So in essence, several requests to do more work, and we have to see whether we will manage. But still our intention is to bring it to the November meeting, and then we need to, and then we want to adopt this opinion.
Okay, so we will simply see next time when we talk what happened.
Yes.
Yes. Before we wrap up, maybe a couple of words on union authorizations.
Yeah. We also had union authorizations, of course. That was the last 2 days. We had 4 union authorization applications. 2 were very straightforward. 2 others took a long time. Active chlorine, maybe not that much to mention about it. Let's say we've seen already many of these similar applications. The main thing which was the case for these 2 applications was that these were very huge applications. In fact, applications we've never seen before. So in this case, we dealt with a consortium. There were more than 30 companies behind it. And that meant that, we talk about hundreds and hundreds of uses which are covered within one application. So that means that the risk assessment became very complex and elaborate, and all assessments, in fact, from efficacy, from the documents we had. We have this summary of product characteristics, this SPC document, which is normally a document of, let's say, something like 50 to maybe 100 pages, but in this case it was hundreds of pages. So that was, let's say, complex to deal with in sense of the sheer volume of all our documents. There were also many comments, not always of a, let's say, a fundamental nature, but also some, let's say, some corrections or questions which would need to be addressed by the committee. So in the end, very happy that we managed to process these through. And I think there we all agree to that it would be good if these type of applications will not be made in the future. And we also think that's not going to happen because there is new guidance on how companies can put together what is called the Biocidal Product Family. This was done under the old guidance where there was more flexibility, let's say, and in this nowadays it's somewhat more restrictive. So I do not think we will see this something like this ever again. But it was something, let's call it, of a burden to members, and especially the rapporteur, in this case the French authorities, who dealt with these two applications.
Intensive meeting, I can hear. Thanks for this summary, Erik. We'll have Erik back with us after the next committee meeting, which takes place at the end of November. Until then, you can find all our episodes at eca.europa.eu/podcasts.
Safer Chemicals Podcast. Sound science on harmful chemicals.